my friend and chairman Bruce Westerman put it best. He said, when the Democrats talk about polluters over people, what they're actually referring to is not this bill, it's actually a reference to where we are now, thanks to Democratic reckless and radical policies. Right now, China is actually the largest emitter of CO2. Russian gas is much dirtier than gas from other places around the world, especially the United States, where you have cheap, reliable, and clean natural gas. But instead of taking advantage of our God-given resources, Democrats, their reckless, radical policies make us more dependent on these forms of energy that are much dirtier. And my good friend from Massachusetts said this bill will drag us back decades. Well, I do want this bill to take us back, not decades, but just to a few years ago when we had a Republican in the White House. Let us not forget that the United States, again, we currently lead the world in CO2 emissions, but between 2018 and 2019, the total reported greenhouse gas emissions from large facilities fell nearly 5%. So yeah, let's go back. Let's go back to that time. I find the talk about costs somewhat interesting because only in Washington, D.C., only in a place that lacks logic and accountability like Washington, D.C., can future revenue be considered a cost. Think about that. It's considered a cost. The math does not make sense. And it's also quite alarming. It's also quite fascinating that my friends across the aisle are now talking about deficits, which for the last 4 years, they voted for over $4 trillion of increases to spending. But before I yield to my good friend from Texas, Dr. Burgess, I'd like to point out to a real life example of what happens when we follow far left Democratic environmental policies. Often I wish that we had a real life example that we could talk about in terms of policy. And here we do. It's called Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, trying to search for a great ESG score to, appease globalists, appease the ruling elite, appease woke Wall Street investors. They went for this ESG score, and right now they're almost a failed state. Sri Lanka's Green New Deal, to be clear, was a human disaster. It's an ill-advised national experiment. Let me explain it. They went to organic farming. Organic farming yielded nothing but starvation, poverty, and chaos. President Rajapaksa, with no warning, with no attempt to teach farmers how to cope with change, announced a ban on all synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Again, he was after that ESG score. 90% of Sri Lanka farmers relied on synthetic fertilizers, and after the ban, 85% of farmers experienced crop loss. The damage done by this organic order was so extensive that the former president had to reverse himself less than 7 months later. Now let's just bring this to political reality. The goals of the United States, only 20% of electricity is powered by renewable energy here, 20% renewable, and less than 10% of American families own an electric vehicle. By the way, those that own electric vehicles are overwhelmingly people that make over 6 figures a year. It's not your average Americans that are driving around in Teslas. Yet the left seeks to unilaterally ban all hydrocarbons and instill these pipe dreams that the U.S. will generate all of its energy through wind and solar. All you have to do is look at California to see what comes next. Last August, Governor Newsom announced that they will ban the sale of gasoline cars by 2035. And just one week later, after that announcement, 1 week later, the electric grid was overwhelmed in California, and the state had to ask EV owners to limit when they plugged in their vehicles to charge. So if you ask yourself, where does the policies of the left lead us? Look no further to the idiocracy of the policy in California. Look no further to the almost failed state of Sri Lanka. That's where these reckless, radical policies will lead the U.S. economy. But for more, I want to yield 3 minutes to my good friend from the great state of Texas and fellow